This is the story of Shiphrah and Puah, two midwives who stood against the most powerful ruler in Egypt. When Pharaoh commanded them to destroy innocent lives, they had a choice: to obey a king who ruled the land or to fear the God who ruled all things. Their courage would not only save lives but also shape the future of an entire nation. True bravery is not found in power or weapons, but in choosing to fear God over man. The cry of a newborn pierced the thick, humid air. Sweat dripped from Shiphrah's brow as she carefully wrapped the tiny infant in linen, her hands practiced and steady. Beside her, Puah worked quickly, placing a cool cloth on the mother's forehead, whispering words of encouragement. The dimly lit home smelled of crushed herbs and damp clay walls, the scent of life itself. Outside, the city of Ramses hummed with the sound of Egyptian soldiers marching through the streets. But inside this small house, there was only the quiet miracle of birth. The mother reached for her baby, her face still flushed from labor. Is he healthy? Shiphrah smiled softly as she placed the infant in her arms. He is strong, like his mother. Tears welled in the woman's eyes as she clutched her son close. May the Lord bless you both for helping me. Shiphrah exchanged a look with Puah. They did not need thanks. They needed protection. Because if Pharaoh's guards knew what they had done, they would not live to see another morning. It had begun weeks ago in the grand halls of Pharaoh's palace. The two midwives had been summoned without warning, dragged past towering gold pillars and into the presence of the most powerful man in the world. Pharaoh sat on his throne, his gaze cold and calculating. "The Hebrews are growing too numerous," he said, his voice sharp like a blade. "They fill our cities, they work our fields, and soon they will rise against us." Shiphrah and Puah remained silent, their heads bowed. Pharaoh leaned forward. "You are midwives, are you not?" Shiphrah hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, my lord." A slow, cruel smile spread across Pharaoh's face. "Then you will serve me in a new way." He stood, his robes sweeping across the marble floor. "When a Hebrew woman gives birth, if it is a son, you will kill him." Puah's breath caught in her throat. Shiprah's hands curled into fists at her sides. The command hung in the air like a curse. Kill the baby boys? Kill the future of their people? The women dared not look at each other, afraid their faces would betray the horror in their hearts. Pharaoh's dark eyes narrowed. "Do you understand?" Shiphrah forced herself to nod. "Yes, my lord." But even as the words left her mouth, she knew one thing for certain. She would never obey him, and neither would Puah. Now, standing in the small home, watching the mother cradle her newborn, Shiphrah knew they had made their choice. They had chosen God's command over Pharaoh's. But choices had consequences, and sooner or later, Pharaoh would know they had defied him. Puah placed a reassuring hand on her friend's arm. "We will leave before dawn." Shiphrah nodded, swallowing hard. "And if they come looking for us?" Puah met her gaze, eyes steady. "Then we will trust the God who gives life to protect ours." The baby let out a tiny cry, and the mother soothed him, whispering a prayer of thanks. But the danger was only beginning. The stars flickered in the sky as Shiphrah and Puah slipped through the darkened streets of Ramesses, their feet barely making a sound against the dusty earth. The city was asleep, but their hearts pounded with fear. They had defied Pharaoh's command. They had let a baby boy live. And soon, someone would notice. Puah gripped Shiphrah's arm, whispering, "We cannot keep doing this forever." Shiphrah's jaw tightened. "What choice do we have?" Puah hesitated. "If Pharaoh finds out, he will kill us." Shiphrah exhaled sharply. "Then let him." Puah stared at her, stunned. Shiphrah turned, her expression fierce. "Do you think I fear him more than I fear the God who gives life, the God of our fathers? No, Puah. We will do what is right, no matter the cost." For a long moment, Puah said nothing. Then she nodded, because she knew Shiphrah was right, and because deep inside she had already made her choice. The next morning, the whispers began. A palace guard had gone to inspect the Hebrew settlements, and rumors were spreading. Some of the baby boys had survived. Shiphrah and Puah continued their work as if nothing had changed, but fear lurked beneath every breath. Then it happened. A soldier appeared at their door. His armor gleamed in the morning sun, his expression unreadable. "You are summoned to the palace." Shiphrah and Puah glanced at each other. It was time. The grand hall was colder than before, despite the heat of the Egyptian sun. Pharaoh sat high on his throne, his expression dark, his fingers tapping against the armrest. "I have heard disturbing things." Shiphrah and Puah stood still, their heads bowed. "There are Hebrew boys who should not exist." His voice was sharp as a blade. "Do you have an explanation for this?" Puah lifted her chin, forcing her voice to remain calm. "My lord, the Hebrew women are not like the women of Egypt. They are strong. They give birth before we arrive." Pharaoh's eyes narrowed. The silence stretched. The air was heavy. Then he laughed, a slow, amused chuckle. Shiprah's stomach twisted. Was that a good sign or a warning? Pharaoh leaned forward. "If they give birth before you arrive, then I must take another course of action." His gaze turned cold. "From this day forward, every Hebrew boy that is born shall be thrown into the Nile." A shiver ran down Shiphrah's spine. Puah's breath hitched. The room felt smaller, darker, suffocating. Pharaoh smiled. "That way, I do not need midwives to do my work." He waved his hand, dismissing them. The decision was final. That night, the Hebrew settlement was filled with weeping. Mothers clutched their newborns, holding them close, knowing what was to come. Fathers whispered hurried plans, desperate to hide their sons. Shiphrah and Puah stood in the midst of it all, helpless. They had done what they could, but now Pharaoh's cruelty had gone beyond them. Puah turned to Shiphrah, her voice shaking. "What do we do now?" Shiprah's hands trembled at her sides. Then she lifted her eyes to the heavens. "We wait for God to act, because Pharaoh was strong, but their God was stronger." The cries of the Hebrew mothers echoed through the night, their wails mingling with the distant sounds of the Nile's waters. Word had spread. Pharaoh's soldiers had already begun their search. Doors were being pounded upon. Infants were being taken. Fathers who resisted were struck down where they stood. Shiphrah and Puah moved through the shadows, their hearts pounding in their chests. They had spent their lives bringing children into the world, yet now they were surrounded by the weight of Pharaoh's death sentence. A woman clutched Puah's arm, her eyes wild with fear. "They came to my house today," she whispered. "I hid my son in a basket beneath the grain. I told them he died, but they are coming back." Shiphrah took her hands. "Keep him hidden. God will make a way." The woman's face was full of uncertainty, but she nodded, clinging to the words as if they were the only thing keeping her standing. They continued through the camp, stopping when they reached a small hut where several Hebrew families had gathered, their voices hushed, their bodies tense with fear. An elder sat near the door, his wrinkled hands gripping his staff tightly. "Pharaoh has gone too far," he muttered. "Our people have been slaves for generations, but now he seeks to erase us completely." A young man clenched his fists. "We should fight," another scoffed. "Fight with what? Our hands? Our tools? Pharaoh has chariots and swords. We have nothing." Puah's voice was steady. "We have God." The room fell silent. Shiphrah stepped forward. "We must not let fear lead us. If we stop delivering these children, we let Pharaoh win. We are midwives. We serve the giver of life, not the taker of it." The elder's eyes studied them both carefully. "You have already defied Pharaoh once. Do you not fear what he will do when he discovers the truth?" Shiprah's hands trembled, but her voice did not. "I fear God more than I fear any man." Puah nodded. "If we stand by and do nothing, we are no better than Pharaoh himself." The young mother who had spoken earlier clutched her sleeping child closer to her chest. "Then what do we do?" Shiprah's gaze was firm. "We keep delivering the children. We keep protecting them however we can, and we pray." The elder sighed. "Pray for what?" Puah took a deep breath. "For deliverance." A murmur spread through the room. Some nodded, some hesitated, but none argued. The decision had been made. That night, as Shiphrah and Puah walked back through the camp, the cries of the mothers still echoed in their ears. The burden of their choice weighed heavily upon them, but they had no regrets. They had done what was right, and somehow they knew God had heard them. Would you like me to continue? The days that followed were filled with fear and whispers. The Hebrew mothers hid their newborns in baskets behind woven mats anywhere they thought might keep them safe. Fathers stood guard at their doors, gripping nothing but wooden staffs, knowing they were no match for the sharp-edged swords of Pharaoh's soldiers. And yet, the midwives continued their work. Shiphrah and Puah moved from house to house in secret, delivering babies in the still of the night, muffling their cries with soft cloths and praying over each child before placing them in their mother's trembling arms. But the tension in the air grew thicker with each passing day. One morning, as the sun rose over the Nile, Puah returned from a delivery and found Shiphrah sitting outside their small dwelling, her face pale, her hands clenched in her lap. Puah's stomach twisted. "What is it?" Shiphrah looked up, her eyes dark with worry. "Pharaoh knows." The words struck like a hammer. Puah swallowed hard. "How?" Shiphrah exhaled shakily. "There's been talk. Soldiers searching the homes more aggressively. The palace scribes keeping records of births. They are beginning to see the numbers don't match. The children are still living, Puah." Puah's heart pounded. They had always known this moment would come, but now that it had, the weight of it pressed against her chest like an unbearable stone. "We should leave the city," Puah whispered. "Go into the hills, hide with the shepherds." Shiphrah shook her head firmly. "And what of the women who are still with child? Who will be there when their time comes? Who will stand beside them when their cries echo through the night?" Puah pressed her lips together. Deep down, She knew Shiphrah was right. The only way to stay safe was to abandon their calling, and that was something they could never do. A sharp knock at the door made them both jump. They exchanged a look before Puah cautiously rose and opened it. A tall figure stood in the doorway, one of Pharaoh's royal messengers. Shiphrah rose slowly, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her chest. "What business do you have with us?" The messenger's face was unreadable. "Pharaoh has summoned you both. Immediately." Silence stretched between them. Puah's fingers dug into the doorframe. "And if we refuse?" The messenger did not smile. "Then you will be dragged to him in chains." Shiphrah gave Puah a long, steady look before stepping forward. "We will come." The messenger turned on his heel, expecting them to follow. Puah hesitated, her heart hammering. "Shiphrah." Shiphrah met her gaze. "Fear God, Puah, not Pharaoh." Taking a deep breath, Puah stepped beside her friend. They walked together through the dusty streets, toward the towering palace, toward the wrath of a king. But even as their feet carried them forward, they knew one thing with absolute certainty. They did not walk alone. The palace loomed before them, its towering columns gleaming under the burning Egyptian sun. Shiphrah and Puah walked in silence, their hearts steady, but their minds racing. The weight of Pharaoh's wrath was something every Hebrew feared, but they had already made their choice. Two guards led them through the grand hall, where the scent of incense mingled with the polished stone and golden statues of Egypt's gods. Slaves scurried past, heads bowed, while noblemen lounged in the shade of wide pillars, whispering as the midwives passed. Finally, they were brought before the throne. Pharaoh sat high above them, draped in fine linen, his golden crown reflecting the light. His expression was unreadable, but his dark eyes held the sharpness of a man who was not accustomed to being defied. The silence stretched until, finally, he spoke. "You have been deceiving me." Shiphrah did not flinch. "My lord?" Pharaoh's jaw tightened. "Do not play foolish games with me. The Hebrews multiply faster than ever. My men have found boys in homes that should not exist, and the women still speak your names in blessing." A cold wave of fear swept through the room, but Shiphrah did not let it show. Pharaoh leaned forward, his voice dangerously low. "I commanded you to kill the Hebrew sons. You were given an order. You have disobeyed." Puah felt her throat tighten, but she took a step closer to Shiphrah, her voice calm and firm. "My lord, the Hebrew women are not like the women of Egypt. They are strong. They give birth before we arrive." The lie sat between them, wrapped in the truth. Pharaoh studied them, his fingers drumming against the arm of his throne. The tension in the air was suffocating. Then suddenly, he laughed. It was a cold, humorless sound. "You expect me to believe that?" Neither woman spoke. Pharaoh's gaze darkened. "Perhaps you think your God has spared you, that he will protect you from my hand." He leaned forward, his voice cutting like a blade. "But hear me well. You cannot stop what is coming." He stood, his robe sweeping across the floor as he descended toward them. "Since you refuse to carry out my will, I will do it myself." His voice dropped to a whisper, full of menace. "Every Hebrew son that is born shall be cast into the Nile." Shiphrah's hands clenched at her sides. Puah's breath hitched. Pharaoh's cruel smile returned. "This way, I do not need midwives to do my work." Then he turned his back to them. "You are dismissed." The guards stepped forward, motioning them toward the exit. Shiphrah and Puah walked out, their heads held high, their feet steady, but inside their hearts were breaking. They had done what was right. But now, Pharaoh had unleashed a new kind of terror. As they stepped back into the streets of Ramesses, they knew the cries of the Hebrew mothers would soon grow louder. And once again, they would have to decide what could be done in the face of such cruelty. The cries had already begun. As Shiphrah and Puah walked back through the streets of Ramesses, the news of Pharaoh's new decree spread like wildfire. Mothers clutched their sons tighter, fathers whispered desperate plans, and older children huddled together, their faces pale with fear. Pharaoh had spoken. Every Hebrew baby boy was to be thrown into the Nile, a death sentence written in water. Puah felt sick as she passed a young woman holding a newborn against her chest, her body trembling. The woman met Puah's gaze, her eyes wild with grief. "They took my neighbor's son this morning." Her voice was barely a whisper. "He was only 2 days old." Shiprah's fingers dug into her palms. She turned to Puah. "We must warn the others." Puah nodded. "But what can we do?" Shiphrah exhaled sharply. "We do what we have always done." Puah swallowed hard. "We save as many as we can." They moved quickly, slipping through the Hebrew quarter, knocking softly on doors, whispering words of caution. "Hide your sons," they warned. "Do not trust anyone outside your family." Some wept as they listened. Others nodded in quiet understanding. And some had already lost too much to hope. One woman, her face hollow, shook her head. "It is no use. Pharaoh will not stop until we are destroyed." Shiphrah knelt beside her. "Pharaoh is not God." The woman's lips trembled, but she said nothing. As the sun set over the city, Shiphrah and Puah found themselves standing at the edge of the Nile. The river stretched wide before them, the waters reflecting the sky in a way that was almost peaceful. But they knew the truth. This river, this source of life for Egypt, had now become a grave for their people. Puah hugged herself. "What if we fail?" Shiphrah stared at the waters, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then God will send another to save them." Puah turned to her friend. "Do you believe that?" Shiprah's eyes did not waver. "I have to." A sudden rustling nearby made them turn. A woman stepped from the reeds, a bundle in her arms. A baby! Shiprah's breath caught. The mother was young, her eyes shining with fear and sorrow. "I cannot keep him hidden any longer," she whispered. "They are searching the houses, and I have no place left to run." Puah stepped closer. "What will you do?" The mother hesitated, then lifted her gaze toward the river. "I will place him in the Nile." Puah's stomach twisted. "No!" But the mother shook her head. "Not to die." With trembling hands, she unwrapped a small basket woven from reeds, sealed with tar and pitch. "I have made a little ark for him. I will let the river carry him, and pray that God will do the rest." Shiphrah felt tears sting her eyes. "What is his name?" The woman kissed her baby's forehead. "Moses." The name settled over them like a whisper of something greater. Puah reached out, resting a hand on the mother's shoulder. "Then may the Lord carry him to safety." The woman nodded, stepping toward the river's edge. Carefully, she placed the basket among the reeds, letting the current gently pull it forward. For a long time, they watched as the tiny vessel drifted down the Nile. None of them knew where it would end. None of them knew what would become of the child. But as the moonlight touched the water, Shiphrah felt something stir deep in her heart. Hope. It was fragile. It was small. But it was there. The Nile stretched before them, silent and deep, carrying away the tiny basket that held more than just a child. It held a prayer, a desperate hope for salvation. Shiphrah and Puah stood motionless, watching as the baby drifted out of sight. They had seen many mothers weep for their sons, had seen too many taken before they could even live. But this was different. Puah exhaled shakily. Will he survive? Shiprah's gaze remained on the water. If God wills it. The mother, still standing at the edge of the river, wiped at her eyes. His sister is following from a distance. She will watch and see where he goes. Puah turned, surprised. And sure enough, among the tall reeds, a young girl moved carefully along the shoreline, her eyes locked on the floating basket. Shiphrah placed a hand over her heart. Perhaps the Lord has a plan greater than we can see. They remained there for several moments, standing in quiet grief, in quiet hope. Then at last, the mother turned to them. You must go before Pharaoh hears of this. Puah nodded, though the weight of the moment still pressed against her chest. And you? The mother took a deep breath. I will return home and pray. Shiphrah and Puah exchanged a glance before slipping back into the city streets, hearts heavy, yet strangely lifted. By the time they returned to the Hebrew quarter, news had already spread. More babies had been taken. Soldiers had gone from home to home, tearing through the settlements like wild dogs. Shiphrah clenched her fists. How much longer must we endure this? Puah's lips tightened. Until the Lord delivers us. But how long would that be? The answer came sooner than either of them expected. The next morning, Pharaoh summoned them again. The great hall was even more crowded than before, with nobles and priests standing at Pharaoh's side. His expression was sharp, his patience clearly worn thin. Shiphrah and Puah bowed low. Pharaoh's voice was like ice. I know what you have done. The words sent a shiver down Puah's spine, but Shiphrah remained still. Pharaoh's gaze burned into them. You let them live. Shiphrah lifted her chin. We serve the God of our fathers. Gasps rippled through the court. No one spoke to Pharaoh in such a way. Pharaoh stepped forward, towering over them. And do you think your God can protect you from my hand? Puah's voice was steady. Yes. Pharaoh's jaw tightened, and for a moment the silence in the hall was deafening. Then without warning, he laughed. A slow, humorless chuckle. He turned to his nobles, shaking his head. These Hebrew women, they are bolder than our own priests. Some of the nobles laughed uneasily, though the tension remained. Then Pharaoh's expression darkened. You will no longer serve as midwives. Puah's breath caught. Shiphrah remained frozen, her mind racing. He was cutting them off. No longer would they be able to help their people in secret. No longer would they be able to protect the innocent. Pharaoh leaned in. Go back to your people. But know this, nothing you do will stop what is coming. He turned away, dismissing them with a wave of his hand. Shiphrah and Puah exchanged a glance. They had been spared, but at what cost? As they left the palace, Puah's thoughts churned. What do we do now? Without our work, we cannot help the women. Shiphrah exhaled. God has not abandoned us. Puah hesitated. Then why does it feel like Pharaoh is winning? Shiphrah placed a hand on her friend's shoulder. Because his time is not yet over. Puah frowned. And when will it be? Shiphrah looked toward the sky. Soon. The weight of Pharaoh's words followed Shiphrah and Puah like a storm cloud. As they walked through the narrow streets of Ramesses, their feet moved slowly, not from exhaustion, but from grief. The city bustled as always, markets open, guards on patrol. But the Hebrew quarter was quieter now, heavier. Like every breath cost something. They had spent years delivering life into the world, holding newborns close, calming terrified mothers, whispering prayers into tiny ears. But now, Pharaoh had issued a decree so cruel it threatened to erase that purpose. To the world, it looked like the midwives had been stripped of everything, but not to Shiphrah. As they passed a group of Hebrew women washing cloth in a well, Puah whispered, "What do we do now, Shiphrah? Pharaoh has taken everything from us." Shiphrah stopped in her tracks. Her gaze moved across the people, the mothers keeping their children close, the fathers with tired eyes who still knelt to pray. In every corner of the camp, life still pressed forward. "Not everything," she said firmly. Puah turned to her. "What do you mean?" Shiphrah met her eyes. "He took our title, but he did not take our calling. We weren't midwives because Pharaoh allowed it. We were midwives because God called us to be. Pharaoh doesn't get to decide who we are." The words fell like stones into water, rippling through Puah's heart. "But we're not delivering babies anymore," Puah said quietly. "No," Shiphrah agreed, "but we're still protecting life, still comforting mothers, still reminding our people who they are." Puah looked around, really seeing the women and children for the first time in days. "You're right. They haven't stopped. They still have hope." "And that," Shiphrah said, "is what Pharaoh can't touch." The sun began to dip behind the horizon, casting long shadows across the city. But instead of feeling darker, something in the air felt brighter. As if God had not just seen their suffering, but was already working behind it. Days passed, then weeks. And though Pharaoh's soldiers searched every home, turned over every cradle, and threatened every family, the people did not give up hope. And slowly, something began to spread through the camp. A whisper, a story. At first, no one dared to speak it too loudly, but it traveled faster than the soldiers could move, stronger than fear could silence. A baby had survived. One of the boys, plucked from the Nile, saved not by Hebrew hands, but by the very house of Pharaoh. Shiphrah and Puah sat in the shadows of a small gathering of women. No one was loud, no one dared cheer, but in every hushed voice there was light. "They say he was found by Pharaoh's daughter herself. She brought him into the palace. She called him her own. He lives." Puah's hands trembled where they rested in her lap. "In the palace," she whispered. "He's living among them." Shiprah's breath caught in her throat. A flicker of awe lit her face. God hid him in the house of the very king who wanted him dead. Puah turned to her, eyes wide. "Do you think, could this child be the one?" Shiphrah closed her eyes, thinking of all the tears, the silent births, the hiding, the grieving. "God is not finished with us," she said. "He has never been finished." Tears filled Puah's eyes. Then this boy, he's more than just a survivor. Shiphrah nodded. He's a beginning. They didn't know his name. They didn't know what he would become. But they knew this. God had preserved a child. God had placed him in the heart of Egypt. God was writing a story greater than any of them could imagine. And though they were just two midwives, faithful in quiet ways, their courage had helped carry that story forward. They looked at each other and smiled. Because sometimes the ones who catch the first breath of a baby are also the ones who help deliver a nation's freedom. Because sometimes the ones who catch the first breath of a baby are also the ones who help deliver a nation's freedom.